So, welcome, everyone. My name is Georgetown, and I teach political science here at the CEU. Let me begin by saying a couple of words about the background of this conference. The initiative for this event came from Georgetown University. Our original ambition was to explore potential forms of cooperation between the two institutions, but very soon we concluded that the best way to launch this cooperation is to organize a workshop that is focused on the evolving state of democracy. At similar conferences, it has become almost a cliche to describe our era as one marked by political polarization, declining trust in institutions, the erosion of core democratic norms, and the ascent of strongman leaders. Actually, just yesterday, there were 3 elections held in Europe, and across this contest, parties opposing liberal democracy secured on average about 40% of the vote. Now, at this conference, our aim is to go beyond these generalizations. We would like to refine our understanding of current democratic trends by examining shifts in the quality of democracy across the globe, analyzing the emerging ideological landscape. We would like to go into how the debates on religion and gender intersect with modern nationalism, with new forms of traditionalism, and many other ideological outlooks. We would like to pay particular attention to populist modes of mobilization, also at the normative dimensions of polarization, and finally to cultural conflicts, or you can call them culture wars, that contribute to democratic backsliding. We are fortunate to have 9 distinguished speakers today, each of whom will address the challenges of democracy from their different perspective. In order to ensure a smooth flow of efficient use of time, some of the talks will be grouped into thematic clusters, so there will be opportunity to ask questions, but in some cases after hearing 2 or 3 subsequent lectures. There are quite many people online. I would like to welcome them as well. They will also have possibility to ask questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. Depending on time, we will try to devote some attention to their questions as well. So I would like to very much acknowledge the help and contribution of Professor Frank Vella, economist from Georgetown University, with whom we organized this conference together. And we hope for some similar events in the future as well. Now, I would like to begin by inviting to the stage Professor Michael Coppedge, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. And he's also principal investigator for the Varieties of Democracy project, which is, I think, requires no introduction. He's a specialist of Latin American politics, of comparative methods, and he's a foremost authority of the measurement and conceptualization of democracy. His latest co-edited book, Why Democracies Develop and Decline, came out with Cambridge University Press in 2022, and it's a really flagship publication of the field. So I would like to ask Michael to take the stage.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, Scholt, and I want to thank Scholt and Frank Vella very much for this invitation to come speak at this important workshop. I'm going to begin by giving an overview of what I'm going to say. I'm a strong believer in signaling what's going to happen. If I can get this up here. Oh, start sharing. Okay, there we go. Here's my overview. So here are the arguments I'm going to make. First, that the erosion of democracy is, at least so far, actually confined to a few dozen countries, and that democratization in general tends to follow a punctuated equilibrium. And there are certain variables that explain the tendency toward establishing an equilibrium, which countries tend to find. But there are other variables that are better and more useful for explaining the punctuations, the interruptions in the equilibrium that come about. And among the latter variables that explain the interruptions are polarization, populism, and anti-pluralism, which have received a lot of attention lately and that we're going to be talking about a lot today. But I'm going to argue, and this is probably a little contrarian, that populism hurts democracy only when it occurs in combination with anti-pluralist leadership. So by itself, it's not actually harmful, but it often occurs with anti-pluralism. So there's been a lot of discussion in the last few years about whether democracy is in decline. I mean, it seems obvious to many of us that it is, but some people have pointed to graphs like this one that shows the scores, the average scores by region on the Liberal Democracy Index from VDEM. And you can see there seems to be a little bit of a decline, but there's also a big confidence interval around these measures. And so it's not all that clear that the average value for many countries in different regions has come outside the confidence interval. This is one way to do it. There are other ways of doing this, and I'll show you one in a minute. I say that there is a significant decline going on in democracy, but I also want to be careful not to exaggerate how much of a decline there is. A lot of people have cited the report, the democracy report issued by the VDEM Institute that says that 70% of the world population now lives in autocracies. And I think this is technically true, but that doesn't mean, I mean, people have, I think, misused this or drawn wrong inferences from this conclusion. It doesn't mean that 70% of the countries are autocratic, and it doesn't mean that there's been a sudden overnight turn toward autocracy in the world, because when we use population-weighted figures, we're largely talking about India. And India did not become an autocracy suddenly. There was a long, gradual deterioration of democracy in India that eventually crossed a rather arbitrary threshold into what the VDEM Institute considers autocracy. And to me, crossing the threshold is not the newsworthy event. And when you're talking about democracy in India, the newsworthy event was the long erosion that came before. India's score actually changed very little in the year in which it supposedly became autocratic. So I want us not to lose sight of the bigger picture. This is the way I prefer to look at it. This is a chart. Let's see, does this? Okay, that works. This divides the number of countries in the world into several different categories. In the dark blue region up at the top of the figure are the countries that significantly improved their score on liberal democracy in the previous year, over the previous year. And the lighter blue are countries that significantly changed and significantly improved liberal democracy in the previous 10 years. And the bottom, the dark red band, corresponds to countries that significantly worsened the liberal democracy score over 1 year. The lighter red band are countries that significantly decreased, had downturns over 10 years in liberal democracy. And the big gray band in the middle is all the countries that did not experience a significant change in liberal democracy over the previous 10 years. And so what I would like to call attention to, especially, is the width of this big gray band. That is, most countries do not change their score on liberal democracy or any other kind of democracy significantly from 1 year to the next, and even from over the past 10 years. There's a lot of stability built into the system. And every year, some countries become more democratic too. Every year of a reverse wave is also contains improvements in democracy in some places. Having said that, I would also recognize that in the most recent year, there are 41 countries that experienced downturns since 10 years before, and only 12 countries that improved. And that ratio of more countries declining than advancing is perhaps one of the worst records that we have. It's certainly worse than in the 1960s and 70s. And I also want to recognize that where erosion is taking place, it's a very serious matter. And I don't want to minimize that at all, because where democracy declines, where it's under attack, people experience a loss of voice, a loss of jobs, loss of information, of accountability, of due process, a loss of power, loss of freedom, and sometimes a loss of home, as many of the faculty at the Central European University know. And also some cases of loss of life or loss of family. And it's troubling to me that the United States appears to be heading down this path very quickly right now. We don't have VDEM data on that because data comes out in January, and that was before, I mean, as of the end of December, that was before Donald Trump was inaugurated for his second term, and a lot has happened since then. But we don't know yet how this score is going to look by the end of this year. But anyway, I want to talk about equilibrium. An equilibrium, I'll talk about punctuated equilibrium. So I've been playing around a lot with VDEM data because I kind of live in the VDEM world these days. And I'm trying to understand the dynamics of democratization. And I've noticed something that hasn't received all the attention that it deserves, which is that there's a pattern of punctuated equilibrium that describes democratization pretty usefully. And what I mean by that is that most countries change very little most of the time. There are very few cases of gradual incremental democratization in the world. The kind of pattern that we have experienced in the United States, or you've seen in South Korea or in Colombia, those are gradual incremental democratizations. But most countries vary more dramatically, but they vary within certain bounds. Sometimes they're uniformly high, like Switzerland, and sometimes they're uniformly low, like Saudi Arabia or China, or sometimes they're kind of stable at an intermediate level, like Paraguay. But some countries experience a rapid upturn or a rapid downturn, or sometimes a sequence of upturns and downturns that are very dramatic, punctuating periods of relative stability. So we've seen rapid transitions, for example, in Spain, Algeria, Mongolia, Chile, and also rapid breakdowns in Uruguay, Thailand, Venezuela, and sometimes some of these cases have had both. So what forces could explain these long periods of stasis or lack of change? And what forces could explain the rare interruptions in the equilibrium? I think there are different kinds of forces or variables that differ in how dynamic there are. And I'll talk about 4 different kinds of variables. First, there are the relatively static variables, things that happened a long time ago and have changed relatively little since then. So things like geography, the locations of countries in the world and how they're related to each other. Climate. Culture tends to be, I mean, it evolves, but it's relatively fixed compared to other things. Ethnicity, the ethnic mix, religion, natural resource endowments, things like that are pretty static. Secondly, there are incremental forces, things like income and wealth, which vary somewhat year to year, but they tend to be on long trends that change they change a little bit from where they were the year before. The level of education, of occupational diversity and inequality in society. A third kind of factors are episodic factors, things that kind of follow this punctuated equilibrium, where they have periods of relative stability with periods interrupted by periods of sudden change. Things like institutions, technology, party dominance, alliances, trade relations, and international power dynamics that sometimes go through periods where relations between superpowers change. And finally, there are the very dynamic factors, things that we expect to change pretty rapidly all the time, things like economic growth, inflation, social movement campaigns that rise and fall, are there for a few years and go away, leadership, natural disasters like earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, et cetera, and wars also last for a while and then they end. So I would argue that an equilibrium develops and is sustained in a country when there are some very strong static forces and there are some incremental forces that reinforce um, um, the equilibrium that has formed in the past. It's not that nothing is changing, it's that the same old things which are powerful are checking each other and balancing each other repeatedly, and they reproduce this balance incrementally. And that leads to a situation called homeostasis. And this is from the 2022 book that Schultz mentioned. In the concluding chapter, we have result of some empirical models, some path models that look at relationships among several variables over a long period of time. And one of the arguments that I've come to is that there are some very distant variables that change very little, which I'm calling distal variables like population, European population, Protestant population, resource dependence. There are things like development. These are the classic modernization variables like literacy and agricultural income and GDP per capita. And then there are some institutions and practices that become pretty stable and vary episodically. Institutionalized political parties, high state capacity, and the participatory environment for civil society organizations. And these three things, I argued in that chapter, form kind of a protective belt that tends to reinforce whatever the level of democracy is in a country. And it works that way because each one tends to compensate for or correct the others. So that if state capacity takes a hit and like there's a big corruption scandal, then sometimes political parties step in if they're institutionalized and they can exact corrections, or civil society become activated and they can put pressure on the state to reform itself or on parties to carry out those reforms. If civil society becomes attacked, then sometimes political parties come to its defense, and so on. These things reinforce one another and they help preserve an equilibrium. And that is a system called homeostasis. So I would argue that that goes on, and that's one useful way to understand why countries are often in a situation where they're not changing very much. But the equilibrium is disrupted or punctuated when there are dynamic forces that disturb the equilibrium, which could be things like the death of a leader, an earthquake or hurricane, economic crises, powerful civil rights campaign, profound scandal, something like that. So this is a model not of levels of democracy, but of upturns, the amount of positive change there is in the system. And what I would point out here is that there is only one of these elements of the protective belt that's still present in this model for dynamic change. These other things are still in the background, but there are new variables here which are more dynamic. Economic growth, campaigns by civil society, especially nonviolent campaigns, and the previous level of polyarchy. Those matter. And for the downturns, it's the same situation. We've got a little bit of the variables that are part of the protective belt, but we still have economic growth, different aspects of civil society movements, left-wing, right-wing, anti-system movements, and polyarchy, which are more dynamic things that help explain the situation. So different variables come into play. But when there are disturbances, it doesn't mean that the long-term and medium-term forces are no longer relevant. They're still there in the background, helping to influence what's going on. I tend to think about powerful engines. This is a metaphor. Metaphors can be misused. I hope this is more or less accurate, but I think of powerful engines that are driving great gears that are grinding together. And someone may throw a wrench into the machine and cause a disruption, and the gears stop grinding for a little while, but the big engines are still there. Somebody repairs it and they go on grinding and doing their work. The powerful machines are still there. And applying that mechanism to democratization, the fact that a transition or breakdown, or in our language, sometimes we call them upturns and downturns, which you could call erosion if it's rather slow. When those things happen, it doesn't mean that the machinery of the state has fundamentally changed, and that the new regime that results from an upturn or a downturn will last. It will still seek some kind of equilibrium, which is determined by the longer term forces. And I suggest that the current reverse wave could be understood as the reversion of many of the new democracies to their prior equilibrium. The biggest wave, for example, the biggest wave of democratization the world has ever experienced was after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Around 1989 to 1991, there were many more countries that became democratic during that period than ever before in world history. And many of these cases were deficient in some elements that are found in the protective belt. So, for example, here's a relationship between, on the y-axis, the changes in electoral democracy between 1992 and 2024. So below the red line, there are cases that declined. It shows the amount of their decline. And on the x-axis, we have a measure of the rule of law, which we call transparent laws with predictable enforcement. And you can see that the countries that declined most after 1992 were countries that tended to be rather weak on the rule of law, much more than the countries that were strong in that regard. And this is a sample of countries that began in 1992 above the arbitrary threshold of 0.5 on the polyarchy scale. So these are countries that began as being democratic in 1992, and what happened to them after that. Weak rule of law means a bigger decline. This is looking at the strength of civil society. The relationship is not as strong here, but there is some relationship. So you find countries with weaker civil society like Venezuela, Nicaragua, Hungary, Belarus, Turkey, Ukraine, experiencing larger declines than countries that had stronger civil society like Philippines and Argentina. The relationship is not as clear. In fact, it looks like the opposite relationship for institutionalized parties. I think it would be a little bit different if I were able to include Mali and Niger, which are excluded from this graph because they didn't qualify for this threshold of democratic in 1992. It happened a little bit later, a few years later for them. So it's a drop from this sample. But I think there's also some relationship there. But anyway, the equilibrium, whether it's democratic or not, is even more evident if we open up the idea of democracy, look inside the concept of democracy, and look at the relationship among components of democracy. And I don't think many people have attempted to do this before, but because we have BDEM data that disaggregates the concept of democracy into many components and hundreds of variables, we can start to look at relationships. And we tend to treat these relationships among, for example, suffrage, free expression, free association, elected officials, clean elections, judicial constraints, rule of law. We tend to look at these things as defining elements of democracy, and we treat the relationships among them as being logical relationships, conceptual relationships. But I think an argument is to be made, and we can explore this, that some of the relationships among them are correlational or perhaps even causal, that to some extent having independent courts provide some expression, some protection for free expression, that having a vibrant civil society can make elections more clean. Things like that may be going on. So I'm beginning to test some models to look at what those relationships are. And this figure is too confusing to try to go through it in detail. But I think the main thing I want you to take away from this is that there are a lot of arrows pointing to a lot of things, that a lot of these components of democracy are related. Just one little bit of explanation. Things inside the green circle are things that are happening in the same year. Things that are inside the yellow circle are things that happened the year before, and things outside of that are things that happened 2 years before. So time goes from the outside in here. But there are a lot of connections among things. There are a lot of mutually reinforcing relationships among components of democracy, which I would argue also is an important part of the explanation for why equilibrium tends to form. Because if there's weakness in the quality of elections, then civil society pressure, free expression, criticism from the media, application of the courts through the rule of law, all those things would tend to restore things to whatever level is there. But it also works in the other direction. If most of these things are weak and the quality of elections is poor, the legislature can't check the executive, there are constraints on free expression of things, then there's probably a lower level equilibrium, and that tends to be reinforced by the other weaknesses in the system as well. So I think that's another way to understand things. I would also say that some of the components are a little more exogenous. They're causes more than they are effects. Things like freedom of assembly. And some of them are more endogenous, such as having elected officials. Excuse me. But the overwhelming impression is that there are dense connections among all of the components. And this helps us understand why there is an equilibrium that tends to reproduce itself. But sometimes there are more dynamic short-term factors that can disturb the equilibrium and make change, as upturns or downturns, larger. And there's been a lot of attention to what I would call the 3 Ps lately: polarization, populism, and anti-pluralism, including some of the people in this room have worked a lot on that. And I've been looking at these questions empirically as well, and I have some conclusions that may be a bit surprising. First is that polarization hurts democracy. Okay, that's not surprising at all. Although there's a bit of a debate about whether polarization harms democracy or problems with democracy increase polarization. Which way the causal error points is under discussion, and I haven't tried to resolve that debate at this point. The second conclusion is that populism is not necessarily bad for democracy. In fact, in the absence of anti-pluralist leadership, it actually has a small positive relationship. Thank you very much. And this may also be reverse causation. It may be that only highly democratic regimes allow populist parties to win elections. The third conclusion is that anti-pluralism, a characteristic attitude or set of positions that political parties and their leaders take, is the main culprit, which makes sense, but it deserves more emphasis than populism in my view. And fourth, the combination of anti-pluralism and populism is very bad for democracy, worse than anti-pluralism alone, and certainly worse than populism alone. Of course, these conclusions depend a lot on how we define these concepts and how we measure them. So I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about that. And these are fairly conventional concepts. The way that I'm conceptualizing them, and which is based on how VDEM and the spin-off project V-Party conceptualizes these things. It has a lot in common with how Kirk Hawkins has talked about populism and Kasmuda and other people in the field. So polarization we define as a situation in which supporters of opposing political camps are reluctant to engage in friendly interactions, for example, in the family, in civic associations, free time activities, and workplaces. It's an effective polarization relating to emotions that has impact on behavior. Populism we define as having 2 qualities: anti-elitism and people-centrism. So anti-elitism could be summarized as how important is anti-elite rhetoric for this party, how people are talking about things, and people-centrism. Do leaders of the party glorify the ordinary people and identify themselves as part of them? And so the basic data from this come from B-Party, which rates individual political parties in election years for different countries. In order to use this in a cross-national panel data set, I needed to aggregate this to the country level. So I aggregated the scores for parties into party seat share weighted country means. That is, I weighted a populism score for each party in the system by the share of seats that the party won, and they calculated a weighted average for the party system as a whole, and did that for each election year, and then carried forward those values for the rest of the election period. And I mean, for all the years after the election until the next election occurred, or the electoral system was interrupted, in which case it becomes missing. So the measure here is the degree of populism for the average legislator as of the most recent election. For anti-pluralism, it's more complicated, but it's a weighted average of 4 variables, and I won't go into so much detail, but it's looking at personal attacks or demonization by party leaders against their opponents, political pluralism, that is a clear commitment by party leaders to free and fair elections with multiple parties, freedom of speech, media, assembly, and association. Oops. Minority rights, commitment to minority rights rather than imposing the will of the majority on the entire country, and rejection of political violence. And so also, these are scores for parties, but I've aggregated them to country years. And looking at the relationship between populism and anti-pluralism, since that's a key thing that I'm looking at, they're not the same thing. Populism and anti-pluralism are different concepts, and empirically they're not related, at least when they're aggregated this way. You can see from the scatter plot, we have populism on the x-axis and anti-pluralism on the y-axis. And most populists are anti-pluralist. That is, the lower right corner of the graph is empty. There are not many cases there, but there are a few exceptions in that zone. Anti-pluralists are more likely not to be populists. There are more anti-pluralists who are not populist than ones that are. And non-populists tend to not be anti-pluralists. So basically, the point is that they're not the same thing. They need to be estimated and they need to be measured separately in order to look at the relationship. So some examples of this, like if you do a classic 2x2 table and talk about examples of politicians that are populist and anti-pluralist, there are some well-known examples: Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Alexander Vucic in Serbia, Erdogan in Turkey, and Tsipras in Chile. But at the other extreme, there are people who are not populist and not anti-pluralist, like Mauricio Macri, conservative president, former president of Argentina. Same thing for Sebastián Piñera in Chile. Angela Merkel, more conservative, but certainly pro-democratic and not populist in Germany, and Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. But we have some presidents who are anti-pluralist, but not populist. I mean, this is a really old combination that's been around for a long time. Juan Orlando Hernandez is not as well known, president of Honduras. He was corrupt and conservative, but not a populist. Vladimir Putin, I would say, in Russia, although he has some populist elements, but according to our measure, he's less populist than populist. Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, Al-Sisi in Egypt, and Joseph Kabila in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, all anti-pluralist presidents who don't fit the populist mode. But there are also populist presidents who are not anti-pluralist, such as Carlos Alvarado in Costa Rica, from one of the conservative parties, kind of a loose coalition of parties, of factions actually, and Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa. So they are somewhat independent of each other. And if I run a regression trying to explain the electoral democracy index, and I've got populism and polarization and anti-pluralism and an interaction between populism and anti-pluralism, we find a negative coefficient. Like the more polarization there is, the less electoral democracy you've got. Populism actually by itself has a positive coefficient, but we really have to interpret that with caution because it's part of an interaction. Same goes for anti-pluralism, which has a negative coefficient, but not significant. But the populism anti-pluralism interaction has a much larger negative coefficient. So what that means is shown in the simulation of the predictions of the model. So this is the predicted value of the electoral democracy index on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is the measure of anti-pluralism. And then I have a different line for each degree of populism. So if we look at the bottom line first, the situation of low populism is associated with kind of a low level of electoral democracy on average, but it doesn't change as a function of anti-pluralism. Anti-pluralism doesn't hurt in that situation. At the other extreme, a high level of populism with a low level of anti-pluralism, which we find up in the upper left corner, that situation is associated with a higher level of electoral democracy. But as anti-pluralism increases, following this line down, as anti-pluralism increases in a situation of high populism, we get to the most negative situation for electoral democracy. And so that means the combination of combination of anti-pluralism and populism is very harmful for democracy. In fact, more harmful than anti-pluralism is by itself. So what are implications of this study? What's an implication for democracy promotion? If we understand these things and take them seriously as some of the levers that could be pulled in order to affect the outcome here. When a country is at a tipping point, like it's on the verge of becoming more democratic or less democratic in a significant way, and it seems like there's some external nonviolent intervention that could give a decisive push toward democracy, then I think that it's worth taking that risk, pushing for that, we could hope for some good results, at least in the short term. However, I think we should have lower expectations about countries that experience a surprising upturn, countries that have suddenly become democratic and in a big way when the underlying conditions that would tend to support that are really missing. We've seen democratization in Haiti, in Algeria, in Egypt, in Mongolia, and in some cases, those just didn't last very long. And I would argue it's because a lot of the things are missing are weak in the protective belt that are not likely to support sustained democracy. But we should also hold on to hope for countries that experience a surprising downturn. Argentina has experienced this multiple times, Uruguay, Poland, and yes, I would say the United States, and perhaps in the future, if conservative parties keep surging, or if conservative anti-pluralist parties keep surging in Austria, Germany, Denmark, France, Italy, etc., then I think we should hold out hope for countries that do have a lot of the conditions that favor democracy in the long term. And so for these reasons, I think democracy promoters should focus more attention on reforms that can be sustained in the long term, reforms that can strengthen institutionalized political parties, reforms that can improve and strengthen the rule of law, reforms that can help civil society organizations become and remain active in politics, and any component of liberal democracy, election administration, respect for political rights and civil liberties, strengthening the independence of the judiciary, enabling legislatures to hold executives accountable. But these kinds of efforts, I think, require sustained effort over a long term, and that is something that many democracy promoting countries have had trouble doing when administrations change and priorities change. But anyway, that would be my guidance for the future. Thank you.